"I'll marry you," Clara Whitmore said, and the entire general store went silent. Caleb Hayes didn't smile, didn't reach for her hand. He just looked at her the way a man looks at something he's afraid to believe in, steady, quiet, and slightly broken around the edges. Behind her, someone laughed. Then another person. Then the whole room. "Clara Whitmore is marrying the mountain hermit," a woman whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. God help that poor girl. Clara didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Caleb and said it again, softer this time, like a door closing on every other option she'd ever had. "I said yes." If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The debt notice had arrived on a Tuesday. Clara found it tucked beneath the front door, like someone had been afraid to knock a single folded page with the Territorial Bank seal pressed into the upper corner and a number at the bottom that made her sit down on the porch steps and stay there for a long time without moving. $412. Her father had been dead for 6 weeks. She'd known about the farm debts in a general way, the kind of knowing you do when you're busy surviving and the numbers are someone else's problem. Her father had always handled the ledger. He'd handled everything, actually, which she understood now was its own kind of problem, because when he died in his sleep on a cold October morning, he took every piece of that knowledge with him and left Clara standing in the kitchen holding a coffee pot and staring at a man she barely recognized. Not her father. Her father was gone. The banker. His name was Morton Hale, and he came to the farm 3 days after the burial with a leather satchel under one arm and a look of genuine regret on his face that Clara didn't believe for a single second. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Truly, your father was a good man." "He was," Clara said. She did not invite him inside. Morton Hale opened his satchel on the porch railing and laid out 4 pages of figures. He walked her through them in a gentle, practiced voice, the way a doctor explains a diagnosis he's delivered 100 times before. The farm had been carrying loans for 3 years. The last 2 harvests had been poor. The interest had compounded. There was a second lien on the east field that Clara hadn't known existed. "I need to be direct with you," Morton said, folding his hands over the papers. "We've extended considerable patience to your family, but with your father gone and no male heir to assume the debt—" "I'm right here," Clara said. Morton looked at her with the expression men use when they're being polite about something they consider obvious. "Of course. What I mean to say is that the bank's position requires us to begin collection proceedings before the end of the year. If the debt is not resolved by December 1st—" "December 1st," Clara repeated. It was October 17th. "The bank will need to take possession of the property." She stood very still after he left. She stood there until the sound of his wagon disappeared down the road, and then she went inside and sat at her father's desk and opened the ledger she'd never been allowed to touch and started reading. It took her most of the night to understand it. By morning, she understood it completely. They were going to lose everything. Her younger brother Thomas was 17 and had been sick for 2 years with something the doctor in town called a weakness of the lungs. He needed medicine every week, imported powder that had to be ordered from Denver and cost more than most families spent on food in a month. Without it, he couldn't work. Without work, he couldn't earn. Without earning, there was no medicine. It was a circle with no exit, and Clara had been running inside it for 6 weeks trying to find a break in the wall. She tried the merchants first. Gideon Purdy at the feed store had known her father for 20 years. He shook his head before she finished her sentence. "I'm sorry, Clara. I can't extend more credit. You understand." She tried the grain broker, the equipment dealer, the woman who ran the boarding house and sometimes lent small amounts to families in trouble. She tried the church deacon who listened with great sympathy and offered to pray for her, which she accepted because it cost nothing and she needed every kind of help she could get. Nobody would lend her money. Nobody would buy the farm at a fair price either. Word had gotten out about the debts, and the only offers she received were low enough to leave her with nothing after paying the bank, which meant Thomas would have no medicine by spring. She was running out of time, and she knew it, and knowing it didn't help, because knowing a wall is coming doesn't give you wings. The morning she went into town and said yes to Caleb Hayes, she had been awake for 36 hours. She hadn't planned to say yes to anyone. She'd gone to Purdy's general store to buy medicine, the last of what she could afford, and Caleb Hayes had been there standing at the counter buying a coil of rope and a small bag of nails, with the careful attention of a man who doesn't waste a single penny. She knew who he was, the way everyone in Ridgeline knew who he was, the mountain cowboy. The hermit. The man who came down from the high country every few weeks for supplies and spoke to almost no one and went back up again like smoke. People didn't dislike Caleb Hayes. They pitied him. He was maybe 32, 33. Broad-shouldered and quiet with calloused hands and a face that had been weathered by altitude and loneliness into something that was almost handsome, but not quite approachable. He wore the same coat every time anyone saw him. His horse was old but well kept. He never complained. He never asked for anything from anyone. "That's the saddest man in the county," her father had said once years ago watching Caleb ride out of town. Proud enough to starve rather than ask for help. She'd thought about that often in the 6 weeks since her father died. She thought about it now. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe she was delirious from exhaustion. Maybe something in the way Caleb counted out his coins with such deliberate dignity made her think of herself. Maybe she had simply reached the bottom of every other option and her mind had quietly decided on something without consulting her. She said, "Mr. Hayes." He turned. Up close, his eyes were gray and careful. His. "I know this is unusual," she said, "and I know you don't know me well, but I have a proposition for you if you're willing to hear it." He waited. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look anything particularly just attentive the way a man who lives alone gets good at being, because when you have no one to talk to, you learn to listen carefully to the things that find their way to you. "I'm losing my farm," she said. "I owe the bank more than I can pay. My brother is sick and needs medicine that costs more than I earn. I have no one to help me and nothing to offer." She took a breath. "I'm 24 years old. I'm capable. I work hard, and I don't quit, and I keep my word. I need a husband. I need someone whose name I can put on a legal arrangement that might give me enough footing to save what's left of my family." The store had gone quiet. Gideon Purdy was pretending to count nails behind the counter. Caleb Hayes looked at Clara Whitmore for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I have a cabin in the mountains. It's not much. The winters are hard." "I grew up in Colorado," she said. "I know what winter is. I'm gone for days at a time. You'd be alone often. I've been alone for 6 weeks. I can manage." "I don't have money to give you," he said, and something shifted in his voice when he said it. Not discomfort exactly, more like a man stating a rule he's made for himself. "I can offer you a home and my name, that's all." "That's more than I have now," Clara said. He studied her face. She didn't look away. "All right," he said. And that was when the laughter started. It began as a murmur. By the time Caleb Hayes walked out of Purdy's general store with Clara Whitmore beside him, half the town had opinions. "Did you hear? That was Ida Beaumont, who had once been a friend of Clara's mother, and now managed her social status like a ledger. Clara Whitmore is going to marry that mountain man, the hermit, the poor one. Lord in heaven, what is she thinking?" "She's desperate," someone said. "You can't blame her. She's got a sick brother and a drowning farm. But him, he owns nothing. He is nothing. She could at least have waited for a real offer." Clara heard all of it. She was meant to hear it. That's why it was said in the register. It was said in loud enough to land quiet enough to deny. She stopped walking. Caleb, 2 steps ahead, turned back. "Clara," he said. "I hear them," she said. "I know. Does it bother you?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "It used to," he said. "It doesn't anymore." "Why not?" He looked at her with those gray eyes. Because what other people think of what I have and what I am are two different things. I stopped confusing them a long time ago. She fell into step beside him again. She didn't know then what he meant by that. She filed it away. The wedding was 3 days later. It was performed by Judge Alderman, who did it without ceremony because neither of them wanted ceremony. Thomas came. He sat in a chair because standing for long exhausted him, and he watched his sister say her vows to a man he'd never met, with an expression Clara couldn't read somewhere between grief and relief, and something that might have been hope. "You don't have to do this," Thomas told her the night before. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," she said, "not one that works." What if he's not a good man?" Clara looked at her brother. "He counted his coins today like everyone mattered. He looked me in the eye when I told him we had nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't make me feel ashamed." She paused. "Those things matter more than people give them credit for." Thomas was quiet a moment. "He really has nothing. Just a cabin." "That's what he says." "And you believe him?" She thought about the strange weight in Caleb's voice when he'd told her that. The precise, deliberate way he'd said it, like a man reciting something he'd decided to be true, rather than something that was simply true. "I don't know," she said. "But I'm going anyway." On the morning they were to leave for the mountains, Caleb arrived at the farm before dawn with a wagon and a second horse, a young roan mare that he tied to the back. "For you," he said. "In the mountains, you need your own horse." Clara stared at him. "You said you had no money." "I said I had no money to give you," he said without embarrassment. "The horse is not money. The horse is practical." "Where did it come from?" "It was mine," he said simply. He helped her load what she needed, which wasn't much because most of what she'd owned was now tied to the farm she was leaving in Thomas's name. The bank arrangement had taken 2 days to complete. Caleb's name on the filing had been enough to create a brief stay of proceedings. It wasn't a solution. It was a door held slightly open. Thomas stood on the porch when they pulled out. "I'll send word," Clara called back. He raised his hand. He looked small. She faced forward and didn't look back again. Looking back was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had expected the journey to take a few hours. It took 2 days, and with every mile they climbed, something began to shift in Clara's understanding of the man sitting beside her. It started with the trail. The road out of Ridgeline was familiar. She'd traveled it a dozen times over the years, but at a certain point, maybe 4 hours out of town. Caleb turned the wagon off the main road onto a path that wasn't marked. "Is this a road?" she asked. "It's a route," he said. "What's the difference?" "Roads get mapped," he said. "Routes get remembered." She looked at the trees closing in on either side. "Do other people know about this route?" No. She waited for more. He didn't offer more. She had already learned that Caleb Hayes operated in silences the way other men operated in words, not because he had nothing to say, but because he rationed speech like a man who understood its value. They camped that night beside a stream she didn't recognize on any map she'd ever seen. Caleb built the fire quickly and efficiently. He made coffee without being asked and handed her a cup without ceremony. They ate in silence for a while. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "Why does no one know where you live?" He turned the cup in his hands. The fire between them was the only sound for a moment. "Because," he said, "when people know where you live, they come to visit. And when they come to visit, they want things." "Everyone wants things," Clara said. "That's not a reason to disappear." "No," he agreed. "The reason to disappear is when what they want is something you can't give without losing yourself." She let that settle. "Were you married before?" she asked. "No." "Were you close to it?" He looked up from the fire. "Once, a long time ago." He paused. "She chose my family name over me. I didn't understand the difference at the time. I do now. Clara studied his face. In the firelight, he was harder to read than in daylight shadows did things to expression. But she heard something in his voice that she recognized. The sound of a wound that had been cleaned and stitched and left a scar over but not forgotten. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. It taught me what I needed to know. What was that? He looked back at the fire. That most people don't actually see you. They see what you have. They see what you represent, what you can provide. He paused. Very few people look at a man who appears to have nothing and decide he's worth their time. He said it plainly, not with bitterness, not with accusation, as though he were simply reading a fact out of a ledger. But Clara heard the shape of it. He wasn't just talking in abstractions. He was talking about her, about what she'd done in the general store. She opened her mouth to say something she wasn't sure what, but he shook his head slightly. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's the hard part of the climb. Okay. The second day, the terrain changed. They moved through country that felt increasingly like a secret narrow passes, hidden cutbacks, a canyon wall that turned out to have a gap in it wide enough for the wagon. Caleb navigated it all from memory without hesitation, and she began to understand that this man had not traveled this route dozens of times. He had traveled it hundreds. Who built this? She asked, pointing to a section of cut stone that bridged a creek crossing. I did, he said. 7 years ago. You built a stone bridge alone. I had help, he said. But I designed it. Where did you learn to design a bridge? He was quiet for a moment. My father sent me east for schooling when I was young, engineering mostly, some law. I didn't stay long enough to finish. He glanced at her. I found the books more useful than the institution. Clara absorbed this. A cowboy who had studied engineering, who built bridges, who knew law. She thought about the deliberate way he'd counted his coins, the deliberate way he'd spoken to her, the weight in his voice when he described what he had. She filed it all away. Dig. It was past noon on the second day when they crested a ridge and Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop. Look, he said. She looked. Below them, set into the fold of the mountain, like something that had grown there rather than been built, was a valley. Not a small valley. Not a clearing. A valley, green and deep and organized in the way that land gets when it has been worked and cared for by many hands over many years. She could see structures, not a cabin, not a collection of shacks, but actual buildings. Timber-framed, well-maintained, arranged with intention. She could see a main house that was large and solid. She could see what looked like a barn, then a second barn. Corrals. A long building she couldn't identify. Smaller cabins scattered along the valley floor, a dozen or more each with smoke coming from its chimney. She could see people. Moving between the buildings, working in fields. A group of children near one of the smaller structures. She looked at Caleb. She looked back at the valley. She looked at Caleb again. What, she said carefully, is that he didn't look at her. He looked at the valley the way a man looks at something he loves and is afraid of and is tired of hiding. That, he said, is home. Clara did not speak for a long time, and then very quietly she said, You lied to me. No, he said. You told me you had nothing. You told me there was a cabin. You told me... I told you I had no money to give you, he said. That was true. You told me the winters were hard, and you were gone for days, and I'd be alone. All true. Caleb. Her voice was low and flat and controlled in the way that voices get when they're working very hard to stay that way. What is that? He finally turned to look at her. It's complicated, he said. Then uncomplicate it. He held her gaze. Drive down with me. Let me show you. Then I'll answer every question you have. You'll answer them now. Clara. He said her name differently than anyone else had said it in her memory. Not with pity, not with patience, not with condescension. just directly, like a statement of fact. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But there are things I need you to see before I can explain them properly. Please. She stared at him. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't apologize or back down. He just held the word please in the air between them and let her decide what to do with it. She took the reins. Drive, she said, and then you will explain everything. They descended into the valley on a path that had been graded and maintained. As they came closer, she began to see details she'd missed from the ridge. The buildings were not new. They'd been built over time. She could see it in the different ages of the timber, the way each structure bore its own history. But all of it was maintained carefully. Nothing was falling apart. Nothing was abandoned. And the people stopped what they were doing and watched as the wagon came down the path, not with suspicion, with something else. Something she identified after a moment as relief, or maybe recognition. The kind of look people give when someone they'd been wondering about has finally come home. A man came out from the main house. He was older, maybe 60, native with white at his temples, and a way of standing that suggested long practice with stillness. Caleb, he said. Henry, Caleb said, and there was an entire relationship in those two words, years of it, history of it. Henry looked at Clara. He looked at her in a way that was not rude, but very thorough, the way experienced people look at things they're trying to understand. This is Clara, Caleb said. She's my wife. Henry nodded. Figured it'd be soon, he said. Been watching you get ready for it. Clara looked at Caleb. Getting ready for it. Caleb stepped down from the wagon. He came around and offered her his hand, which she did not take immediately. Clara, he said, please come inside. I'll explain everything. I promise you I will explain everything. She climbed down without his help. She turned to face the valley, the buildings, the workers, the children near the far cabin, who had stopped to look at her. How many people live here? She asked. At present, Henry said 43. Clara breathed. 43, she said. Yes, Henry said. He said it the way you say something that ought to be explained by context, because the context was all around them. She turned back to Caleb. This is what you've been doing, she said. When you came to town, when you bought your rope and your nails. She heard her own voice shift. You were buying supplies for 43 people. More or less, he said, and letting everyone in town believe you were poor. He didn't answer. Why? She said. Why would anyone? She stopped. Something was working itself out in her head, something that connected every strange thing she'd noticed about him since the moment he'd looked at her in the general store. The way he'd said he had no money to give her. The precise distinction between giving and having. The bridge he'd built, the route that wasn't on any map. Because, she said slowly, you needed to know. He was quiet. You let them believe it, she said. Because you needed to know who would choose you when they thought you had nothing. The valley was very quiet. A wind moved through the grass below. I've been lied to before, Caleb said. By people who knew what I had. I built this place to get away from that. To rebuild something that was mine. But I knew that eventually. He stopped. Started again. I knew that I wanted more than this valley. I just couldn't risk what I'd built on a wrong judgment. So you tested me, she said. No, he said, and his voice had something raw in it. I gave you what I believed I had. I gave you honesty about what the life would cost, about what I couldn't offer. I wasn't testing you. I was... He looked at her. I was hoping you'd say yes anyway, and that would tell me something true. And what did it tell you? He looked at her for a long moment in the mountain light with 43 people and a hidden valley and years of secrets all around him. That you're the first person who ever chose me when they thought the only thing I had to offer was myself, he said. Clara stood in the middle of that answer for what felt like a long time. She thought about the bank, about Thomas in his chair, about Gideon Purdy and his careful sympathy and his absolute refusal to help. She thought about what it had cost her to walk up to a stranger in a store and say out loud that she had nothing and needed someone. She thought about what it had cost him to let himself be seen as poor for years to guard this valley to wait. She was furious. She was also somewhere underneath the fury beginning to understand something. "I need you to show me everything," she said. "All of it. Every building, every person, every secret." "Yes," he said, "and you will not hide anything from me again." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I won't." "Swear it." "I swear it," he said without hesitation. Clara looked at the valley one more time, at the smoke from the chimneys and the children and the man named Henry, who watched her with old knowing eyes. Then she looked at the man she had married, this man she had chosen when she believed he had nothing, this man who had turned out to be something entirely other than what she was told he was. "Then let's start," she said, and she walked toward the house ahead of him. Henry fell into step beside her as she approached the main building, and Caleb followed slightly behind, and she had the strange sensation of entering something she had not agreed to, something larger and older and more complicated than a marriage. "The main house," Henry said as she stepped inside. She stopped. The interior was not what she expected. It was not grand. It was not decorated with the proof of wealth, no velvet, no gilt, no excess. It was large, yes, and solidly built, but it was the interior of a working house, a functional house. There were maps on the walls, not paintings. There were ledgers on the desk, not ornaments. There were tools hung near the door, and there were people moving through it. A woman carrying bread from a back kitchen. A young man spreading papers across a table, an older woman seated near the window mending something. They all looked up. They all looked at Clara. "This is Mrs. Hayes," Henry announced. The woman with the bread stopped. The young man with papers looked at Caleb with something that might have been surprise. The older woman near the window simply nodded, like she'd been waiting. "I want to understand what this place is," Clara said to the room as much as to Caleb. "Someone explain it to me, please." The older woman spoke first. Her name, Clara would learn, was Elsa. She'd come to the valley 4 years ago with a broken arm and no money after her employer had let her go when she could no longer work. She spoke simply and without drama. "This is the place Caleb built for people who had nowhere else to go," Elsa said. "I was one of them. Most of us were." Clara turned to look at Caleb. He stood in the doorway of his own house, with his hat in his hands, and that careful, guarded expression. She was beginning to recognize the face of a man who does not easily let himself be seen. 43 people, Clara said. "At present," he said. "It's been higher." "And you've been doing this how long?" 7 years, Henry said. 7 years, she repeated. She looked at the maps on the wall, at the ledgers, at the woman who'd come here broken and stayed to bake bread. "Where does the money come from?" A pause. Caleb looked at Henry. Henry looked at the ceiling. "Caleb," Clara said. "My family," he said. "I come from money, old money, territorial money, land grants, early mining rights. My father built a company. When he died, I inherited most of it." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't want it, or I didn't want what it did to the people around me. So I put a manager in place in Denver, and I came up here and I built something I actually wanted." She absorbed this in layers, the way you absorb a truth that comes in pieces. "The man in town," she said. "The banker, Morton Hale. He talked about a second lien on the East Field, a second lien nobody in my family knew about. He said the bank had been patient for years. He made it sound like—" She paused. "Is it possible someone knew about your family money and traced it toward my father's farm? Tried to manufacture a debt close to you to see if—" She stopped. She watched Caleb's face change, not dramatically. But she was already learning to read his small movements, and what moved across his expression now was not surprise. It was recognition. "Caleb," she said slowly. Did you know about my family's debt before you came into that store? The room was very quiet. Henry looked at the floor. Caleb looked at Clara, and in his eyes she saw the precise shape of the thing she had not wanted to find. Not all of it, he said. I knew the bank was moving on property in the area. I knew your father had died. He stopped. I came to town to look into it. I didn't intend for what happened in the store to happen the way it happened. But you came to town because of me, she said. Because of my family's situation. Because someone has been trying to get hold of land in this valley for 2 years, he said. And they started by going after the farms nearest the mountain. Your father's farm is on the route into this territory. If someone takes it, they can control access to you, she said. The realization arrived fully formed. She was not a coincidence. She was a variable in a problem she hadn't known existed. She looked at Caleb Hayes, her husband of 3 days, the poor mountain cowboy who wasn't poor, the hermit who ran a hidden valley, the man who had let her believe he had nothing, and she felt something fierce and complicated move through her. Not betrayal, not exactly, something older and harder. So, she said, what exactly have I married into? Caleb held her gaze. A fight, he said. I'm sorry, I should have told you everything from the beginning. I know that. I didn't, and I can't take that back. He paused. But everything I said in that store was true. I have a home. I can offer you safety. Your brother can come here, get the medicine he needs, live somewhere that's not a debt notice. And in return, she said. In return, nothing, he said. I'm not keeping score. You brought me here because you needed me in your valley, close, under your name. No, he said, and something flared in his voice. I brought you here because you walked up to a stranger and made the bravest ask I have ever witnessed from any person. And when you looked at me, you were scared and exhausted and completely ready to go to war for your brother and I. He stopped himself. I wanted to help you, that's all. The rest is complicated, and I'm not pretending it isn't. But I wanted to help you. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas counting the days until December 1st. She thought about Morton Hale and his leather satchel and his genuine regret. She thought about the bridge Caleb had built 7 years ago over a creek that wasn't on any map. All right, she said finally. He blinked. All right. You said you'd explain everything. You said you'd hide nothing from me again. She looked around the room at Henry, at Elsa, at the maps on the wall. So start from the beginning. Tell me about the fight. Tell me who's coming. Tell me what they want. She met his eyes. Because if I'm in this valley, I am in this valley. And I don't lose. Something moved across Caleb Hayes' face that she hadn't seen before. She would later learn that it was hope, the specific startled kind that comes from something you'd stopped believing in. He set his hat down on the table. Sit down, he said. It's a long story. I have time, Clara said. I'm not going anywhere. Caleb talked for 2 hours. He talked the way men talk when they've been carrying something alone for a long time, and finally have permission to put it down. Not easily, not smoothly, but steadily, the way water finds its level. He sat across the table from Clara in the main house with Henry beside him, and a cold cup of coffee between his hands, and he told her the truth. His father's name was Robert Hayes. 30 years ago, Robert Hayes had come to Colorado Territory with nothing but a surveyor's eye and a refusal to quit, and he had built a land and timber company that eventually controlled more acreage in the high country than most people knew existed. He had not been a gentleman. He had not been a dishonest man either, not exactly. But he'd operated in the space between law and intent that early territorial business always occupied, and he'd made arrangements with partners whose character he'd perhaps examined less carefully than their capital. One of those partners was a man named Edmund Voss. Voss came in as a minority investor when I was 12 years old, Caleb said. My father needed capital to develop the northern timber contracts. Voss had money and connections in Denver. It looked like a good arrangement. He turned his cup. My father died when I was 22. I inherited the company and discovered that Voss had spent 15 years quietly inserting himself into every legal document he could reach. He hadn't done anything criminal exactly. He'd just repositioned himself. On paper, his stake in the company had grown from 17% to something closer to 40%. How? Clara asked. Compound interest provisions buried in refinancing agreements, reinvestment clauses that triggered automatically, secondary partnership arrangements my father had signed without reading the fine print. Caleb's voice was flat, not angry, the flatness of a man who has already processed his anger and moved through it. My father trusted him. Voss used that trust like a tool. What did you do? I hired a lawyer, 2 lawyers. It took 3 years of territorial court proceedings to establish what was legitimately mine. He looked at her. I won. But winning cost me nearly everything I'd inherited in legal fees, and by the time it was over, Voss had made it his personal mission to recover what he believed he'd lost. He's been coming after you since, Clara said. Clara. Not directly. Voss is smart enough not to come directly at anything. He's spent the last 7 years working around me, buying land that controls access routes, pressuring suppliers, finding my contractors, and making them better offers. Caleb paused. 2 years ago, he started going after the farms. Henry spoke then for the first time in a while. He doesn't want the farms, he said. Farmland up here is marginal. The growing season is short, the soil is thin. Nobody buys mountain farms for farming. Then what does he want? Clara asked. The valley, Caleb said. This valley, what's under it? Clara looked at him. What's under it? Caleb was quiet for a moment. 7 years ago, when I first came up here, I had a geological survey done. I wanted to know what I was building on. He met her eyes. There's silver under this mountain. Not a great vein, not enough to build a mining empire on, but enough. Enough that if someone controlled this valley and the surrounding land, they could operate a small but very profitable mining operation for 20 years. And Voss knows about the survey, Clara said. He found out about it 4 years ago. I don't know how. I had the surveyor paid in cash and the documents sealed, but... He shook his head. Voss has sources I've never been able to identify. Clara sat with all of this for a moment. She turned it over in her mind the way she'd turned over her father's ledger, looking for the shape of it, the pattern, the thing that connected the pieces. My father's farm, she said. The second lien. The debt that appeared from nowhere. I believe Voss arranged it, Caleb said. I can't prove it yet. But the timing is, the debt appeared 18 months ago. Around the same time, I started noticing movement on the other farms nearest the valley entrance. He was building a wall around you, Clara said. Buying up the access routes, piece by piece. Yes. And my father died, which accelerated his timeline. Which is why Morton Hale came to me 6 weeks after the burial, instead of giving me a full year. Caleb nodded slowly. Hale may not even know who he's working for. Voss is good at using middlemen. Clara looked at the maps on the wall. She looked at them carefully, reading the lines the way her father had taught her to read land documents, slowly looking for what wasn't labeled. Show me where my father's farm is on that map, she said. Henry rose and pointed. She studied it. She looked at the valley, at the surrounding terrain, at the route she and Caleb had traveled from Ridgeline. If he gets the Whitmore farm, she said quietly, he controls the southern approach. Yes, Caleb said. And these other properties, the Brennan place, the Kowalski homestead, these are the eastern and northern approaches. Yes. So right now, she said, turning back to him, he's missing the south, which is why he moved on my family when my father died. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. Nobody in the room spoke. Even Elsa, who had resumed her mending near the window, held her needle still. You should have told me this in the store, Clara said. I know. You let me think I was making a simple arrangement when you knew I was walking into the middle of a land war. I know, he said again, and this time the words had weight in them, not the weight of excuse, but the weight of genuine accountability. I had reasons. They weren't good enough. I'm not going to pretend they were. She looked at him steadily. Give me the reasons anyway. He held her gaze. Because if I'd told you everything in that store, you might have said yes out of desperation, and I would never have known if you meant it. And because—" He stopped. "Because for 7 years I have been surrounded by people who are here because of what I can provide. The workers, the families I've taken in, I'm not complaining about that I chose it. But I haven't had a single person in 7 years who chose to be near me simply because of me." He paused. "I made a selfish choice. I wanted one true thing before everything got complicated again." The room was completely quiet. Clara looked at her husband, this man who had built a valley of 43 people and kept it secret from the world, and was now sitting across from her telling her the honest and unflattering truth about his own motivations. She thought she probably should be angrier than she was. "One true thing," she said. "Yes. And am I that?" He looked at her without flinching. "You walked up to me in a store and asked me to marry you when you believed I owned nothing but an old horse and a broken cabin. I don't know what to call that except honest." He paused. "You're the most honest thing that's happened to me in a long time." Clara stood up. She pushed her chair back and walked to the wall with the maps and stood there looking at them with her back to the room. Nobody moved. "All right," she said finally. "Tell me about Voss, everything. What he looks like, how he operates, who he uses, what he wants beyond the silver." She turned around. "Because if we're going to beat him, I need to know him better than he knows himself." Caleb looked at her. Something changed in his face. Something opened very slightly like a window in a house that's been shut up for winter. "Henry," he said, "bring the other file." What came out over the next hour was a map of Edmund Voss that made Clara's skin prickle with the specific recognition of a pattern she'd seen before, not in land wars, but in the smaller economics of poverty. Voss operated the way debt operated. He moved slowly, incrementally, making each step look unrelated to the last. He never threatened directly. He made offers that seemed reasonable until you looked at what they cost. He put pressure on the edges of a thing until the center collapsed on its own. "He'll come here," Clara said. "Not for the valley, not first. He'll come with lawyers, with documents. He'll find something in your father's original arrangement with him, some clause, some provision, and he'll say he has a legal right to inspect the land." Caleb frowned. "I've had every document reviewed. My lawyers found nothing that gives him access." "Your lawyers found nothing in what you gave them to review," Clara said. "That's not the same thing." She looked at the file. Henry had brought a thick folder of correspondence, legal documents, copies of territorial filings. "Can I read through this tonight?" "Of course," Caleb said. "All of it. Everything I have." She picked up the file. "Then I need somewhere quiet and a lamp that doesn't smoke." Henry almost smiled. "I'll find you one." She read until past midnight. Caleb brought her food she didn't stop to eat. He brought it anyway and left it beside her without comment, which she noticed. Around 10 o'clock, he sat down across from her, not to talk, just to be present, and she found she didn't mind the company. At 11:30 she found it. It was not in the main documents. It was in a letter handwritten from 15 years ago between Robert Hayes and Edmund Voss, confirming an informal arrangement about access easements across the southern watershed for the purposes of resource inspection. The language was vague enough to be almost meaningless, but vague was exactly what Voss needed. "Caleb," she said. He looked up from the corner where he'd been sitting. She held up the letter. He crossed to her in 3 strides and read it over her shoulder. She heard him exhale, slow and controlled. "I've never seen this letter," he said. "It wasn't in the formal file. It was tucked inside another document in a group of correspondence your father wrote in 1869. She looked at him. "Someone organized these files deliberately. Put this here where it might not be found but could be argued to have been disclosed." Caleb straightened. "That means someone who has access to my records is working for Voss," she said. "Yes." They looked at each other. "Henry," Caleb said. Not loudly, just said the name into the room. Henry appeared from the back hallway immediately, which meant he hadn't been far. "The household files," Caleb said. "Who has access?" Henry's expression didn't change, but his stillness deepened. "Myself. Young Marcus, who does the clerical work. And 2 months ago, a new hand we brought on for the winter work. Name of Briggs." "Where is Briggs now?" "Bunkhouse." Caleb and Henry looked at each other with the look of men who have known each other long enough to communicate without words. "Don't do anything tonight," Clara said. Both men looked at her. "If Briggs is Voss's man, he's been reporting. If he disappears suddenly, Voss will know we found something. We're better served letting him keep reporting while we control what he sees." She paused. "Give him nothing useful, and let him think we're still in the dark. That gives us time to prepare." Caleb studied her face. "You've done this before." "Not exactly this," she said. "But I watched my father manage 2 men who were undercutting him in the grain market for 3 years. He didn't confront them. He quietly shifted his contracts and let them believe they were winning until the moment he didn't need them anymore." She looked at Caleb steadily. "You don't win against men like Voss by fighting them at their strongest point. You win by making them think they've already won." The room was quiet. Henry said very quietly, "I think I like her." Caleb didn't say anything. But something in his expression did the thing it had done twice now, that brief, startled openness, like a man catching himself, feeling something he'd forgotten was possible. The next morning, Clara met the valley properly. Caleb took her through it, with Henry beside him, and she began to understand the scope of what he'd built in a way that the map and the ledgers hadn't conveyed. The valley housed 43 people, but that number was almost an understatement for what those 43 people represented. There was a family, the Hendersons, who had arrived 2 winters ago after their homestead was destroyed in a fire. There were 3 unmarried women who'd come separately, each with a story Clara recognized in outline, if not in detail, women who'd fallen through the cracks of a world that offered limited options to unmarried women with no money. There was a man named Tate, who walked with a severe limp from a mining accident and did the valley's metalwork with a precision that made Clara stop and watch. There were children, 8 of them, some with parents in the valley, and 2 who were simply there because Caleb had found them somewhere and brought them back. "Who takes care of those 2?" Clara asked, watching the children from a distance. "Everyone," Henry said, "but specifically. Elsa mostly, and Caleb when he's here." She looked at Caleb. He shrugged slightly. "Children need consistency," he said. "When I'm here, I make a point to be consistent." She filed that away too. She was building a picture of him in her mind, adding to it with every hour the engineer, the protector, the man who built bridges and kept his household in order, and quietly cared for children who had nobody, and who had somehow looked at all of that and decided the one thing missing was someone who would look at him and see none of it. It was the most complicated and most straightforward thing she'd ever encountered. She wasn't sure yet what she felt about it, but she was sure she wanted to understand it. Voss arrived on a Thursday. Not Voss himself, that wasn't his style. He sent 2 men, a lawyer named Croft and a surveyor whose name nobody caught, and they came up the main road into the valley on horseback, with a formal notice that had been filed in the Territorial Land Office in Denver. Caleb read the notice in the doorway of the main house with Henry beside him and Clara 2 steps back. "Access easement," Caleb said. The words came out flat and controlled. "Section 4 of the agreement," Croft said. He was a careful man, precise suit, precise language, the kind of lawyer who says nothing that can't be defended in court. "Your father executed this agreement in 1869 with my client. It grants Mr. Voss the right to conduct a resource inspection of the southern watershed property at any time of year with reasonable notice." "What constitutes reasonable notice?" Caleb said. "The document specifies 48 hours, Croft said. "This notice was filed 72 hours ago." "Who received the notice?" "It was posted at the Territorial Land Office, and a copy was sent to your address of legal record in Denver." Caleb looked at Henry. Henry looked at Caleb. My address of legal record in Denver, Caleb said. Yes, which meant that even if the Denver manager had received it, there was no way it could have reached Caleb in the mountains in time, which meant the notice was technically valid and practically engineered to prevent any real response, which meant Voss had been planning this specific move for a while. Clara had been standing 2 steps back. She stepped forward. I'm Clara Hayes, she said. Caleb's wife. Croft turned to look at her with professional courtesy. Mrs. Hayes. The Southern Watershed property, she said. Can you describe its boundaries as defined in the original agreement? Croft blinked just slightly. It was the blink of a man who hadn't expected the question to come from that direction. The agreement specifies the watershed area south of the 40-degree ridgeline as surveyed in the original 1869 territorial filing. And the access easement covers how much acreage? Approximately 400 acres, Croft said. Thank you, Clara said. She turned to Caleb. Can I see the survey map from 1869? Caleb looked at her with an expression she was beginning to read. It was the expression he made when she did something that surprised him, which was a particular look, restrained, attentive, very slightly off balance. Henry, he said. They gave Croft and the surveyor the guest cabin for the night. Caleb did it smoothly with the hospitality of a man who has nothing to hide, which Clara noted and silently approved of. You never let your opponents see you scramble. You let them rest in your house, and you work while they sleep. She and Caleb and Henry spread the 1869 survey map across the table in the main house, and she went over it with a lamp held close, and her father's voice in her head, the one that said, numbers are never the problem. The problem is always the line that someone else drew. She found it in 40 minutes. The 1869 survey, she said, places the 40-degree ridgeline here. She pointed. But the 1869 filing used a different calibration standard than the territorial surveys that were standardized in 1876. After the Standardization Act, ridgeline measurements were recalibrated across all of Colorado Territory. Henry leaned in. Caleb leaned in. If you recalibrate the 40-degree ridgeline using the 1876 standard, Clara said, the boundary shifts north by approximately 600 feet. She looked at both of them. 600 feet, she said, is enough to put the main house, the eastern stable, and the well, which is the only water source for the valley floor, entirely outside the easement area. Caleb was very still. If the easement doesn't cover the main structures, he said slowly, then Voss's inspection right is limited to undeveloped watershed land. He can walk the hillside. He can't touch the buildings, the infrastructure, the people. More importantly, Clara said, he can't claim any resource survey findings apply to the inhabited portion of the valley, which means his silver argument, if that's what he's building toward, is limited to terrain that would require enormously expensive development to access. She paused. Expensive enough that it might not be worth his while. Henry sat back. How do you know about the 1876 Standardization Act? He said. My father handled land surveys for neighboring farms when they couldn't afford a professional, Clara said. He taught me to read the filings. He said understanding land law was the only insurance a poor family could afford. She paused. He was right. Caleb looked at her across the table. She looked back at him. You need a lawyer in Denver, she said, not the one you've been using. Someone who knows the territorial filing system and can get a recalibration order filed before Croft leaves this valley. How fast can that be done? I don't know Denver's courts, but the recalibration is a matter of objective standard. It's not contested, it's mechanical. Any competent attorney should be able to file an emergency motion within a day. She looked at him. Do you have a telegraph connection you can use without Voss's people knowing? There's a line in Ridgeline, Henry said. But it goes through the main office. Which Briggs could monitor, Clara said. There's another line, Caleb said. 30 miles east at the Carroll mining operation. They run their own telegraph. I've used it once before when I didn't want a message tracked. How long to get there? A hard day's ride. She looked at him. Then you need to leave tonight. He looked back at her. And leave you here alone with Croft and a man who might be Voss's informant. I'm not alone, she said. I have Henry and 42 other people. That's not Caleb? She said his name the way he said hers, directly as a statement. You need to trust me to manage a situation for one day. Can you do that? He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not reluctance exactly. More like the specific vulnerability of a person who has been managing everything alone for so long that the simple act of letting someone else handle something feels dangerous. Yes, he said. I can do that. Then go, she said. Take the roan. She's faster than your horse. He stood up. He looked at her once more. If anything, nothing will, she said. Go. He left before midnight. She heard the horse on the path outside the main house, and then the sound faded into the mountain dark, and she was alone in the valley. Her valley. She was beginning to think of it, and she recognized that thought as the first genuinely strange thing she'd felt since arriving. Henry sat across the table from her. How worried should I be? She asked. Henry thought about it honestly. Croft is a lawyer, he said. Lawyers follow procedure. He won't do anything that could expose his client to liability. He paused. Briggs is the question. Briggs won't move without Voss's instruction, Clara said. And Voss won't instruct him without knowing what we know. She looked at Henry. So as long as we look calm and cooperative tomorrow, we have a day. You're very good at this, Henry said. I'm very good at appearing calm when I'm terrified, she said. That's different. Henry looked at her steadily. You're not terrified. She considered it honestly. No, she admitted. I'm not. She paused. I'm angry. Which works better? Henry nodded slowly. Caleb needs someone who gets angry on his behalf, he said. He gets careful. Too careful sometimes. He thinks his way around things when he should walk straight through them. And you, she said. How long have you been with him? Since before the valley existed, Henry said. I was his father's foreman. When the old man died and Caleb inherited the fight, I stayed. He paused. Not because of the money, because Caleb is the first Hayes who built something instead of just taking something. She heard the weight of that. He doesn't know you see it that way, she said. Henry's eyes were quiet and very old. He does, he said. He just doesn't let himself believe it yet. Clara looked at the maps on the wall. She looked at the letter she'd found, the one that had led them here to this night, to this particular version of the fight. She thought about her father reading land filings by lamplight. She thought about Thomas in his chair on the porch watching her drive away. Henry, she said. Is there paper and ink somewhere? Top drawer of the desk. She got up, found it, sat back down. What are you writing? He asked. A letter to my brother, she said, telling him to come to the valley. She dipped the pen. He needs to be somewhere safe while this resolves itself. She wrote carefully the way her father had taught her to write important letters, every word chosen, nothing that could be misread. Henry watched her and said nothing. When she was done, she folded it and sealed it and wrote Thomas's name on the front. Can you get this to Ridgeline tomorrow? She said. Without Briggs seeing? I have a man who goes down for supplies. He's been with us 6 years. Good. She handed him the letter. And Henry. Yes. Don't let anyone give Croft or the surveyor anything to write on. Not paper, not nothing. I don't want notes leaving this valley tomorrow. Henry picked up the letter. He looked at her with those old, careful eyes. Caleb said you were the first person who ever chose him when he had nothing. He said. He told you that? He told me before he went to town, Henry said. He told me he was going to try. He paused. I didn't know it would happen so fast. Clara looked down at the table, at the maps, the letter, the lamp that didn't smoke. Neither did I, she said. She blew out the lamp. She sat in the dark for a moment with the mountains all around, and the valley breathing quietly below, and 42 people asleep in their beds, not knowing what was coming. Then she picked up the file and started reading again. She had until morning. That was enough. Croft came down for breakfast like a man who owned the house. That was the first thing Clara noticed. He didn't ask. He didn't knock. He simply appeared in the main room at 7 in the morning, with his coat buttoned and his leather case under his arm, and the air of a person who considers himself a guest only in the technical sense. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I trust you slept well." "Very," Clara said. She was already at the table with coffee and the Valley's account ledger open in front of her, which she'd placed there deliberately. A woman doing ordinary household work. Nothing to see, nothing to worry about. "Will Mr. Hayes be joining us for breakfast?" Croft asked. "He rode out before dawn," she said. "He checks the northern pasture line most mornings. He'll be back by midday." She said it smoothly without hesitation because she'd worked out the lie the night before and rehearsed it until it felt like weather, just a fact about the day. Croft's expression didn't change. "I see. We had hoped to begin the survey this morning." "Of course," Clara said. "Henry can walk you to the southern watershed boundary. He knows the terrain better than anyone." She looked up from the ledger. "I'm sure my husband would want you to have every cooperation." She watched Croft hear that. She watched him hear everything that wasn't said, the calm, the confidence, the complete absence of a woman who was rattled by his presence. He nodded. "Very good." She poured him coffee before he could ask for it. Henry took Croft and the surveyor out after breakfast, and Clara waited exactly 4 minutes after they left before she moved. She went to the bunkhouse. She knocked twice, which was one knock more than necessary, because she wanted whoever was inside to have time to become ordinary before she came in. When she opened the door, 6 men were in various states of mourning, pulling on boots, washing faces. Briggs was in the far corner. He was a plain-looking man, maybe 40, with careful eyes, and the kind of stillness that in some people means peace, and in others means calculation. Clara had learned to tell the difference. "Good morning," she said to the room generally. "I wanted to let everyone know that we have surveyors on the southern property today, so if any of you are working in that area, please give them space." She smiled pleasantly. "And if anyone needs me, I'll be in the main house going through the supply records. We're running low on a few things, and I want to get an order together before the weather turns." She let her eyes pass over Briggs just long enough to be natural, not long enough to signal anything. She turned and left. Outside, she breathed. She had just told Voss's man, "Everything is normal. We are not alarmed, we are doing supply records." By tonight, Briggs would have reported that back, and Voss would believe he had, until at least the weekend before the Hayes household understood what was coming. She had bought Caleb another day. Now she needed to use it. The Valley's filing room was a small space off the back of the main house, a room Clara hadn't been shown yet, one she found by following the logical architecture of the building. It held records. Caleb's records. 7 years of them. She worked through the morning with the focus that had always been her best quality, the ability to sit with numbers and documents, long after other people's attention had wandered, to read the same line 6 times until it gave up what it was hiding. What she was looking for was the thread. Not the easement letter they'd found that. Not the survey boundary issue that was Caleb's problem to solve in Denver. She was looking for something else. Something she'd felt the shape of last night while lying awake in the room Henry had given her listening to the mountain dark. Voss had been working toward this valley for 7 years. 7 years was patient even for Voss. Which meant the silver wasn't the whole reason. She found the first piece at 10 o'clock in a folder of financial records from 4 years ago. It was a record of a cash payment, a significant one, from a Denver account for what was listed as consulting services. The account number meant nothing to her, but the date did. It was 3 days after Caleb had told her his geological survey findings had been leaked to Voss. She found the second piece 40 minutes later. A letter unsigned addressed to Caleb's Denver manager, suggesting that the manager reconsider his long-term arrangements, and noting that certain parties were prepared to offer terms that would be substantially more favorable than his current situation. Someone had tried to buy Caleb's own manager. She sat back. She turned that over in her mind. Not Briggs. Briggs was a recent plant good for current intelligence. This was 4 years ago. This was someone who had been inside the operation longer. Someone who had access to the geological survey. Someone who knew about the silver before Briggs was ever sent here. She stood up. She walked to the doorway of the filing room. "Henry," she called. He appeared from the kitchen end of the hallway almost immediately. She was starting to understand that Henry's proximity was not coincidence. He positioned himself near whatever needed watching with the quiet effectiveness of a man who has spent a lifetime protecting things without making a fuss about it. "The Denver manager," she said. "His name? Aldrich," Henry said. "Daniel Aldrich. He's been with the company since Caleb's father. Has anything ever seemed off to you about him?" Henry was quiet for 2 seconds longer than a man with nothing to say would be quiet. "He's thorough," he said carefully. "He keeps the accounts properly. He sends his reports on schedule." "That's not what I asked." Henry looked at her. 3 years ago," he said, "a supplier we'd used for years was suddenly dropped without explanation. I asked Caleb about it. He said Aldrich had found a better price elsewhere." He paused. "The new supplier turned out to be connected to a business associate of Edmund Voss." Clara felt the cold certainty of it arrive in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. "Aldrich is Voss's real source," she said. "Not Briggs. Briggs is just the current eyes in the valley. Aldrich has been feeding Voss information from the Denver end for years." Henry said nothing, but his face confirmed it. "Does Caleb know?" "I've had suspicions," Henry said. "I've never had proof. What I found in there might be the beginning of proof," she said. "But I need to know something." She looked at him directly. "The telegraph notice, the one Croft says, was sent to Caleb's legal address in Denver. If Aldrich received it, he wouldn't have forwarded it," Henry said. "No," she said. "He wouldn't." She paused. "Which means when Caleb gets to the Carroll mining line and telegraphs Denver, the first person he contacts will be Aldrich. And Aldrich will tell Voss," Henry said. They looked at each other. "How long to get a rider to Carroll?" she said. "On a fast horse, 7 hours. "We need to send someone now," she said. "Someone who can reach Caleb before he contacts Aldrich." "That means telling someone what we know." "No," she said. "It means sending someone Caleb trusts with a message that says, 'Don't contact Denver. Find a different attorney. Come home.'" She looked at Henry. "Who do you trust absolutely in this valley?" Henry thought for exactly 1 second. "Marcus," he said. "The young man who does the clerical work. He's Caleb's godson." "How old is he?" 20. "Can he ride hard?" "He grew up on this mountain?" Henry said. "He can ride anything." "Then send him," she said. "Right now, before Croft comes back from the watershed." Henry was already moving. Croft returned at noon looking thoughtful, which Clara did not like. A thoughtful lawyer was a lawyer who had found something. She served lunch with Elsa's help, simple food well prepared, and watched Croft from across the table without appearing to watch him. The surveyor ate quickly and said nothing. Croft ate slowly and said less, which was worse. Finally, he said, "The watershed boundary is clear enough. We'll need to review our survey figures against the original 1869 filing." "Of course," Clara said. "Do you have a copy of the original filing with you?" "We have a copy from the Denver Land Office," Croft said. "Wonderful." She smiled pleasantly. "My husband will want to compare them when he returns. He's very particular about documentation." Croft looked at her. "Is he?" "He is," she said. "He keeps very thorough records. We both do." She let the word both do its work, making clear without stating it that there was a we, now a partnership, and that she was not simply a wife who sat in another room while legal matters were handled. She watched Croft file that information away. After lunch, she found Elsa in the back kitchen. "Elsa," she said quietly. How much do you trust Briggs? Elsa looked at her steadily. I don't, she said. I never have. He talks too carefully. When a man picks every word that precise, he's either very educated or very afraid of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. Or both, Clara said. Or both. Elsa agreed. Is there anything he's asked about since he arrived? Anything that seemed like more than casual conversation? Elsa thought about it. He asked about the silver once. Made it sound like idle talk, said he'd heard a rumor in town that there was mining potential in these mountains. She paused. But nobody in town knows about the survey. Caleb made sure of that. The only way Briggs could have heard that rumor was if someone told him directly. Aldrich, Clara said. Elsa didn't know the name, but she recognized the shape of the answer. Do you want me to keep him busy this afternoon? Elsa asked. Clara looked at the older woman, the one who'd come here broken and stayed to bake bread, and felt something warm move through her. Yes, she said. Keep him occupied. If he asks where I am, I'm doing inventory in the East Storage. Where will you actually be? Reading, Clara said. She spent the afternoon building the case. It was the only word for it. She organized what she'd found, the payment record, the unsigned letter, the supplier connection Henry had mentioned, and she cross-referenced it against the financial reports from Aldrich that Caleb kept in the filing room. She was looking for the pattern, the shape of the leak, the places where information had flowed in one direction and money had flowed in the other. She found 3 more points of contact. Payments that didn't align with invoices. Reports that mentioned the valley's operational details in more specificity than a Denver manager would have any reason to know. And one document, a memo from Aldrich to Caleb dated 18 months ago, that recommended against updating the territorial land filing for the valley, citing unnecessary expense, which would have had the convenient effect of leaving the 1869 survey as the operative document. Aldrich hadn't just been feeding Voss information. He'd been keeping Caleb legally vulnerable. She laid it all out on the table and looked at it the way you look at a completed puzzle, with the particular feeling of having found something that was always there waiting to be seen. Then she did something she hadn't planned to do. She wrote it all down. Every connection, every date, every document reference. Organized and clear the way her father had taught her to prepare anything that might have to stand up to scrutiny. She wrote it like a report. Like something that could be read by a judge. She was halfway through when the door opened, and Caleb walked in. Chud. He was road-tired and dust-covered, and he looked at the table and then at her with the expression of a man who has ridden 30 miles in under 6 hours and arrived to find that the emergency he'd raced toward had been handled. Marcus found you, she said. 4 hours out, he said. I turned around. He crossed to the table and looked at what she'd laid out. He read in silence for 2 minutes. His expression didn't change dramatically, that wasn't his way, but she watched something shift in the set of his shoulders. A loosening, then a tightening. The specific sequence of a man who has just understood something he'd been trying not to understand for a long time. Aldrich, he said. Yes. He was quiet. How long do you think? He said. At least 4 years, she said. Based on what I found, probably longer. He sat down. He sat down the way a man sits when his legs decide for him, not when he chooses it. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. My father brought Aldrich in, he said. He was 20 years with our family. I know, Clara said. She didn't add anything to that. Some things didn't need commentary. Caleb looked up at her. Croft, in the guest cabin, he's waiting for you. She paused. He found something at the watershed. I don't know what yet, he was careful not to say. And Briggs? Elsa has him occupied. He hasn't reported anything today because there's been nothing to report. She looked at Caleb. But that won't last. If he doesn't send word to Voss tonight, Voss will know something's wrong. What do you want to do? She looked at him. He'd said it simply, what do you want to do? Not as deference, not as a man passing off a problem, but as a genuine question from someone who trusted the answer he'd get. She felt the weight of that, the specific gravity of being taken seriously. "I want to let Briggs send his report tonight," she said. "But I want to control what he puts in it." Caleb frowned. "How?" "We have a conversation tonight," she said. "You and me, in the main room, loud enough to carry." She met his eyes. "We have an argument." He stared at her. "About what?" "About the easement. About the valley. About whether you should fight Voss or negotiate." She paused. "You take the position that you're considering a settlement, that you're tired of fighting, that maybe it's time to come to an arrangement with Voss." Understanding moved across his face. "And Briggs reports back to Voss that I'm weakening. Which makes Voss feel secure, which makes him slow down, which gives us time to file the recalibration motion and deal with Aldrich before Voss realizes we know what we know." She looked at him steadily. "You'll need to be convincing." He was quiet for a moment. "You want me to pretend I'm considering giving up what I've built for 7 years?" "Yes." "That will be difficult," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "Can you do it?" He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the general store, and in the firelight on the mountain, and in this room last night when she'd told him to ride. That particular look, she was learning to read the look of a man who keeps finding himself at the edge of trusting someone and choosing each time to step forward. "For one night," he said. "That's all we need," she said. The argument they performed that evening was, Clara would think later, one of the more remarkable things she'd ever done, not because of the acting, but because of how much of it wasn't acting. She took the harder position because it was the one she actually believed in. She pushed hard, her voice carrying the way voices carry in mountain houses in the evening when everything outside has gone quiet. She said, "We don't give up an inch. We file, we fight. We take this to the Federal Land Commission if we have to." She said, "You built this place and these people depend on it, and you do not negotiate with a man who has been lying to you for 7 years. Caleb played his role tired, uncertain the weight of it all, and he was good at it, maybe because some part of it was real too. The exhaustion was real. The years of guarding this place while the threat circled and circled were real. The cost of it was real. What she noticed halfway through was that he was watching her. Not performing at her, not reacting to her lines, watching her. The way you watch something that moves you, and you're not sure yet what to do with that fact. She pushed harder. She said, "If you settle with Voss, what happens to the Hendersons? What happens to Tate and his metalwork? What happens to Elsa, who came here with nothing and built something? What happens to the 2 children with no parents who go to sleep every night because someone decided they belonged here?" She watched something shift in Caleb's face. Something that stopped being performance entirely. He said quietly, going off whatever script they'd had, "You've been here 4 days." She stopped. "You've been here 4 days," he said again, "and you're already fighting for these people harder than I have in years." She didn't have a line for that. She didn't have anything prepared. "Someone has to," she said. And she meant it absolutely. The room was quiet. Outside, she heard a floorboard creak in the hallway, the specific sound of someone who has been listening and has now heard enough. Briggs taking his report home. She didn't look toward the sound. Neither did Caleb. Instead, he said, "All right, we fight." And she heard underneath the performance of it that he meant that too. Later, after the house had settled and the lamp was low, Caleb told her about Marcus. The boy had reached him on the Carroll Road breathless and certain and delivered Clara's message. "Don't contact Denver. Find a different lawyer. Come home." Caleb had turned around immediately, but on the way back, he'd stopped at the Carroll telegraph line himself and sent a message to a man in Denver, not Aldrich. An attorney named Prescott, who had handled the original case against Voss 12 years ago, and who Caleb had not spoken to since. "I told him everything," Caleb said. "The easement, the recalibration argument, what you found about Aldrich. I told him we needed an emergency motion filed within 2 days. Did he respond?" He was still at his office. He responded in 20 minutes. Caleb paused. He said the recalibration argument was correct, and he should have caught the 1876 standardization issue himself the first time. He said he'd file by morning. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. He also said something else, Caleb said. She looked at him. He said that Voss filed a claim last week with the Territorial Mining Commission, a resource extraction claim on the southern watershed of Hayes Valley. He paused. He couldn't file it in his own name because of the contested ownership history, so he filed it through a subsidiary company. What company? Caleb said the name slowly, watching her face. She didn't recognize it. But she caught the shape of it, the way the name was structured. The Colorado territorial suffix, the formation date Caleb recited from memory. When was it formed? She said. 8 months ago. 8 months ago, she repeated. She thought about that. Around the same time Morton Hale came to my father's farm with his leather satchel and his regret. Yes, Caleb said. So Voss forms a subsidiary to file the mining claim, then uses the subsidiary's need to control access land to put pressure on the surrounding farms, then uses the debt mechanics to force a sale that would give him the southern approach. She laid it out step by step, following the shape of it. It's not actually about my father's farm at all. It's about the mining claim. The farm is just a legal mechanism to establish territorial access. Yes, Caleb said. She looked at him. Your attorney Prescott. Can he challenge the mining claim directly? He says the claim has a procedural flaw. Voss's subsidiary doesn't technically have standing to file because its primary registered owner is an out-of-territory entity. Under 1882, Colorado territorial law, resource extraction claims must be held by Colorado residents or resident corporations. He paused. Prescott says if we challenge the standing, the claim gets invalidated. Then why hasn't Voss's lawyer caught that? He probably has, Caleb said. Which is why Voss is moving fast. He knows he has a window before someone challenges the standing. He needs to establish boots on the ground, the survey, the inspection of physical presence before the claim gets thrown out. Because if he can demonstrate active resource operations before the challenge is filed, he might be able to argue continuity of use, Clara said, which would give him a different legal basis for the claim. She sat back. So the survey today wasn't just information gathering, it was evidence creation. Yes. They looked at each other across the table. Did Croft's surveyor take measurements today? She said. I don't know. Henry was with them. She stood up. We need to know right now whether they drove any survey stakes into the ground. Caleb was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Henry had seen the surveyor drive 2 stakes on the southern hillside. He told them this in the back hallway of the main house, his voice low, his expression carrying the specific quality of a man who knows bad news and has been waiting for the right moment to deliver it. Where exactly? Caleb said. Henry described the location. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, running the geography. That's inside the easement boundary as they understand it, he said. If the recalibration isn't filed before Voss's people document those stakes as established markers, then the stakes become evidence of a survey completed under valid easement authority, Clara said, which supports the mining claim's continuity argument. She thought quickly. Can those stakes be removed? She said. Henry looked at her. They're wooden, driven into hillside soil. If they were removed tonight, she said, and Croft goes back tomorrow morning to find them gone. He'd know we took them, Caleb said. Yes, but he'd have no legal recourse. Physical survey markers on your land can be removed by the landowner at any time before the survey is formally filed with the commission. She looked at Caleb. Have they filed anything yet? The surveyor can't file until he completes his report. That takes days usually. Then those stakes need to come out tonight, she said. Caleb and Henry looked at each other. That's technically destruction of, Henry started. Recovery of trespassing property, Clara said firmly. Survey stakes driven on Hayes land without the landowner's written consent for their permanent placement are considered trespassing materials under territorial property law. The landowner has the right to remove them. She paused. I'm fairly certain about that. Henry raised an eyebrow. Fairly certain. 70%, she said. 75. Caleb almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen something that close to a smile on him, not the cautious, guarded version, but something genuine and quick that arrived and left before he could decide whether to let it stay. Henry, he said. I'll have them out within the hour, Henry said. He was already moving. Clara sat back down. She picked up her pen. She had more to write. Caleb sat across from her. He didn't go to bed. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her hand without asking, and they sat together in the lamplight with the mountain pressing in on all sides, and she wrote, and he thought, and after a while she became aware that this was the most comfortable she'd felt in the presence of another person in years. She didn't examine that feeling too closely. She had a case to build. She wrote for another hour before Caleb said very quietly, Clara. She looked up. I need to tell you something I haven't told you yet, he said. She set down the pen. He looked at the table, then at her. His voice when it came had the quality of something that had been kept under pressure for a long time and was finally being allowed to move. Before my father died, he said he told me something. He told me the reason he'd gotten tangled with Voss wasn't just about capital. It was about a debt. A personal debt, a favor he'd owed Voss from years before either of them had any money from a time when my father was starting out, and Voss was the one with resources. He paused. My father said Voss had saved his life once, pulled him out of a mine collapse in the early days, and that everything Voss had taken since was payment in Voss's mind for that debt. Clara was quiet. Voss doesn't just want the valley, Caleb said. He doesn't just want the silver. He genuinely believes that my family owes him, that everything my father built was built on something Voss provided, and that taking it back is justice. She let that sit. Does that change anything for you? She said. He looked at her. Does it change anything for you? She thought about it honestly. She thought about debts, the ones you inherit, the ones you create, the ones people build their entire identity around collecting. No, she said. A man who saves someone's life and then spends 30 years leveraging it isn't owed anything anymore. He spent the debt a long time ago. She looked at Caleb steadily. What he believes doesn't make it true. Caleb nodded slowly. You know, he said, my father would have liked you. She looked at him. He liked people who were direct, Caleb said. He had very few of them around him. By the end, I think he understood why. She picked up her pen. Go to sleep, she said. Tomorrow is going to be difficult, and I need you rested. He stood. He moved toward the hallway. Then he stopped. Clara, he said. Yes, whatever happens with Voss. He stopped. Started again. What you've done in these 4 days. What you've found, what you've managed. He paused. I brought you here because I wanted someone real. I didn't expect. He stopped again. She looked up at him. He looked back at her with those gray eyes that held more than they gave away. I didn't expect this, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Neither did I, she said. Good night, Caleb. He went. She turned back to the page. Outside, somewhere on the southern hillside, Henry was pulling stakes out of the ground in the dark. And in the morning, everything was going to change. Croft discovered the missing stakes at 7:15 in the morning. Clara heard him coming before she saw him boot heels on the porch boards, fast and purposeful. The sound of a man who has found something wrong and is deciding how angry to be about it while he walks. She was already at the table with coffee poured and the account ledger open when he came through the door without knocking. Mrs. Hayes, he said. Mr. Croft. She looked up with the pleasant expression of a woman who has been awake for 3 hours and has used every one of them. Coffee, "The survey markers," he said. "They've been removed." She let a small frown cross her face, the appropriate amount. Puzzled. Cooperative. "Removed? I'm sorry, I don't understand. What markers?" "The stakes my surveyor placed yesterday on the southern hillside. They've been pulled out." She set down her pen with the careful motion of a woman taking a concern seriously. "That's very strange. I'll ask Henry. He was working the south fence line last night. Perhaps there was some confusion about—" "There was no confusion," Croft said. His professional courtesy was fraying now just at the edges. "Those markers were legitimate survey instruments placed under valid easement authority. Then you'll have no difficulty replacing them," Clara said. "If the easement is valid, the right to place markers is valid. Place them again today." She held his gaze with calm that cost her considerably more than it showed. "Unless there's some question about the easement's validity that I should be aware of." Croft went very still. She had just done what a good lawyer does, turned the question back, made him defend his premise. And they both knew it. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Hayes," he said. "Of course, he's in the east stable." She picked up her pen. "Henry can show you the way." She gave them 10 minutes. Then she folded the report she'd spent the night finishing, tucked it inside the account ledger, and walked to the stable herself. Caleb was standing with his arms crossed, and Croft was talking at him, with the measured urgency of a man making an argument he knows is weaker than he'd like. The surveyor stood slightly behind Croft, looking at his boots. When Clara came in, all three of them looked at her. She addressed Caleb directly as though Croft weren't there. "Did you get word from Prescott this morning?" Caleb looked at her steadily. "Just now," he said. He played it perfectly calm, informed, unhurried. "He filed the recalibration motion with the Territorial Land Office at opening this morning. The boundary shift is a matter of objective surveying standard. He expects the recalibration to be certified within 48 hours. She watched Croft hear that. She watched the precise moment he understood what it meant. "The 1876 standardization," Croft said. Not a question. The voice of a man whose lawyer's mind had just run the calculation and arrived at an answer he didn't want. "The ridgeline shifts north by 600 feet under the corrected standard," Clara said, "which places the main structures, the infrastructure, and all permanent improvements outside the easement boundary. The easement right still stands for undeveloped watershed terrain, but the survey stakes your man placed yesterday were in a transitional zone that falls inside the recalibrated boundary." She paused. "Which means they were placed without valid authority. Removing them was our right." Croft said nothing for a moment. A long moment. "You found the standardization issue yourself," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was almost, she thought, something close to professional respect, reluctant and precise. "I read the original filings," she said. "My father taught me to." Croft looked at Caleb. "I'll need to consult with my client." "Of course," Caleb said. "This may take several days." "We're not going anywhere," Caleb said. Croft picked up his leather case. He looked at Clara one more time, that thorough evaluating look, and then he walked out. The surveyor followed without having said a single word. In the silence they left behind, Caleb looked at Clara. 48 hours, he said. "If Prescott is as good as you think he is," she said, "he's very good. Then we have 48 hours before Voss knows his legal position has collapsed." She looked at him. "What does he do when his legal position collapses?" Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "He finds another angle." "What angle?" "I don't know yet," he said. "That's what worries me." Thomas arrived the next afternoon. He came on a wagon driven by one of the Ridgeline men Clara had quietly arranged through Henry's contact, and he arrived looking pale and thin, and considerably more alive than she'd feared the mountain air, she thought, or simply the relief of moving toward something instead of waiting for something to arrive. He stood in the valley and looked at it with the expression of a young man whose sister had told him she was going to marry a poor mountain cowboy, and who had imagined, despite himself, something considerably smaller than what he was looking at. Clara, he said. I know, she said. You said a cabin. I said he said a cabin. Thomas turned to look at Caleb, who was standing a few feet back with his hands in his pockets, and the particular stillness of a man who is meeting his wife's family and is unsure of the reception. You're the mountain cowboy, Thomas said. I am, Caleb said. Thomas looked him over. He was 17 and sick, and had spent 6 weeks watching his family's world come apart, and none of that had taken the directness out of him. My sister married you when she thought you had nothing. She did, Caleb said. She told me you kept yourself poor on purpose, so people would show you who they really were. Caleb glanced at Clara. She gave him nothing, just watched. More or less, he said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. She was right to say yes, he said finally. She's usually right about people. He paused. Don't make her regret it. Caleb looked at the young man steadily. I won't, he said. The two words had the quality of something meant absolutely. Thomas nodded once, then he looked at Clara. You look different. I'm fine, she said. That's not what I said. He studied her face. You look like you're running something. I am, she said. He almost smiled. Good, he said. I always thought you were wasted on the farm. What happened on the third morning came from a direction none of them had anticipated. It came from town. A rider arrived before breakfast with a letter from Morton Hale formal typed, using the bank's official letterhead, informing Caleb Hayes that the debt lien on the Whitmore property had been called due immediately, citing a clause that allowed acceleration of the full debt in cases of material change in borrower circumstances, specifically the borrower's relocation away from the property. Clara read the letter twice, then she read it a third time. Thomas left the property, she said. He came here, Caleb said, which constitutes relocation under the terms of the debt instrument. She set the letter down. Hale is calling the full debt, $412 due within 10 days. They looked at each other. Voss, Caleb said. Voss, she agreed. He can't get us legally on the valley, so he's going around through the farm. If the debt is called and Thomas can't pay, Hale takes possession of the Whitmore property, which gives Voss his southern access route, regardless of what happens with the easement. But Thomas is here, Caleb said. He didn't abandon the property. He traveled to visit family. The clause doesn't distinguish between abandonment and travel, Clara said. That's the point. The clause was designed to be used exactly this way, technically valid, functionally weaponized. She looked at the letter. Someone wrote this debt instrument very carefully. Hale, Caleb said, or whoever told Hale what to write. She set the paper down. We need to pay the debt. I can do that today, Caleb said immediately. She looked at him. If you pay it directly, Voss knows we have the resources. He adjusts his strategy. Clara, if we don't pay it, we pay it, she said. But not through you, not through Hayes' money. She thought quickly, running the options. Prescott, can he arrange a territorial land trust to purchase the debt instrument from the bank? A neutral party holding the lien with terms that are manageable. Caleb stared at her. You want to buy the debt out from under Voss before he can use it? I want to put the Whitmore property in a legal structure that Voss can't touch, she said. If a properly constituted land trust holds the instrument with Thomas as the beneficial owner, Voss has no mechanism to force a sale. The trust documents can be structured to require unanimous trustee approval for any disposition of the property. She paused. Which means he'd need to go to court to break it. And courts take time. Time we'd use to finish what we're building here, Caleb said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him absorb it, the layers of it, the legal elegance of it, the fact that she had produced it in roughly 90 seconds from a standing start. Where did you learn this? He said. I didn't, she said. I'm building it right now from pieces of things my father taught me and things I read in your filing room. She met his eyes. I might be wrong. Have Prescott check it. I will, he said. But you're not wrong. You don't know that. No, he said. But I know you. He said it simply without ceremony, and she felt it land somewhere she hadn't expected. She looked back at the letter. Telegraph Prescott, she said. Tell him about the trust structure. Tell him we need it moving today. Caleb went. She sat with the letter and the account ledger and the morning light coming through the window, and she thought about Voss, a man she'd never met who had been fighting a war against this valley for 7 years. She thought about what Caleb had told her that Voss believed he was owed, that he'd built an entire architecture of grievance around a debt he thought could never be fully repaid. She thought about her father's farm, the debt notice under the door, Morton Hale and his leather satchel, and his regret that she now understood wasn't regret at all, it was theater. It was a man doing what he'd been arranged to do. She felt anger clear and cold and useful. The telegram from Prescott came back in 4 hours. The trust structure was sound. He could file within a day. He had additionally something to report. His challenge to Voss's mining claim standing had been heard by the territorial commissioner that morning, and the commissioner had agreed to schedule a formal hearing. 7 days out, in Denver. And then the part that changed everything. Prescott had located a witness. His name was in the telegram, and when Caleb read it, he went very still. He stood in the doorway of the main house holding the paper for a long moment before he came in and sat down. "Who is Garrett Webb?" Clara asked. She'd read the name over his shoulder. "He was my father's original surveyor," Caleb said. "He did the 1869 survey, the one the easement is based on." He set the telegram on the table. "He's also the man who surveyed the southern watershed when I first came here, the man who found the silver. Prescott found him. He's in Denver. Has been for 3 years. Caleb paused. "He's 70 years old and apparently has been wanting to talk for a long time." She looked at him. "Talk about what?" Prescott says Webb told him that when he did the original 1869 survey, Voss was present. Not officially, he wasn't listed on any document, but physically present, and that after the survey, Voss took him aside and offered him money to file the survey with a deliberately imprecise ridgeline measurement. The room went quiet. "He took the money," Caleb said. "He's been living with that for 15 years. "He'll testify to it," Clara said. Prescott says yes. He says Webb has written documentation notes he kept at the time. He didn't destroy them. He said he kept them because he thought someday it would matter. Clara sat back. This was not what she'd built her case around. Her case had been procedural, the standardization error, the standing challenge, the trust structure. Clean, legal, defensible. But this was different. This was not a technicality. This was proof that the original easement document was obtained through fraud. If the 1869 survey was fraudulently drawn, she said, the easement agreement that references it is void. Not voidable void. It has no legal force at all. Yes, Caleb said. Which means everything Voss has built his claim on the inspection, right, the survey access, the mining claim foundation is built on a document that never legally existed. Yes. She looked at him. Then we have him, she said. Caleb looked at her with those gray eyes, and something in them that she was learning was his version of certainty, not loud, not triumphant, just settled. The way a man looks when he's been fighting a long fight and can finally see the shape of the end. We have him, he said. But Voss didn't wait for the hearing. 2 days before it was scheduled, he came himself. Not with lawyers, not with surveyors. He rode up the valley path in the late afternoon with 4 men and the bearing of someone who has decided that enough time has been wasted on process, and it's time to speak plainly. Edmund Voss was not what Clara had imagined. She'd built a picture in her mind from the documents, a calculating man, cold and precise. The man who rode into the valley was 60, with a large frame gone slightly to weight, and a face that had spent decades in the sun. He had the look of someone who had genuinely believed his own version of events for so long that it had become indistinguishable from reality. He looked at the valley as he rode in the houses, the fields, the people who'd stopped working to watch, and she caught something in his expression that wasn't greed. It was hunger, but a different kind. The kind that comes from feeling owed. He tied his horse and looked at Caleb standing on the porch. "I came to talk," Voss said. "Man to man, no lawyers." "My wife will be present," Caleb said. Voss glanced at Clara. He assessed her in the quick, dismissive way of a man who has never found occasion to reconsider that habit. "If you like." They sat in the main room. Voss took the chair without being offered it. His 4 men stayed outside. Henry stood in the hallway Clara had asked him to and had told him why, and he hadn't argued. "I'll be honest with you," Voss said. He said it the way people say it when they want credit for honesty they're about to undermine. "I know about the recalibration filing. I know about the standing challenge. I know you found Garrett Webb." He looked at Caleb. "Your attorney is good. Or your wife is." He glanced at Clara again this time, with something that was not quite respect, but was in its vicinity. "Someone is good." "Say what you came to say," Caleb said. Voss leaned forward. "Your father and I made a deal in good faith 30 years ago. The deal was never honored, not properly. What your father built, he built with a foundation I provided. This land, this company, this valley." He swept a hand. "None of it exists without that foundation." "You saved his life," Caleb said. "He spent 20 years in business with you. He gave you partnership capital return profit share. He paid the debt. He paid the financial debt," Voss said. "There are other kinds. Name one." Voss looked at him. "Loyalty," he said. "When I needed your father most, when I needed his name on a filing, his backing on a project, he chose the lawyers over me. He chose the courts. He didn't stand beside me." Something old and genuine moved in the man's face. He knew what I'd done for him, and he chose not to remember it. The room was quiet. Caleb said, "My father died not knowing who to trust. He died surrounded by people who wanted what he had, and he couldn't tell anymore who'd come for him and who'd come for the wealth. You were part of why he couldn't tell." He told me about you," Caleb said. "In the last weeks, he said the worst thing he'd ever done was not the business mistakes. The worst thing he'd ever done was let someone's generosity become a chain around his neck until he didn't know how to look at that person without fear." He looked at Voss steadily. "You saved his life. He was grateful, but somewhere along the way you stopped letting him be grateful and started using it. And when someone uses your gratitude against you, it stops being a gift. It becomes a debt that can never be paid." Voss's jaw was tight. "I want the valley," he said. "I want what I'm owed." "You're not owed this," Caleb said. "The law may disagree. The law," Clara said, "is going to hear from Garrett Webb that the document your entire claim rests on was obtained through fraud." She said it cleanly without heat, the way you state something that is simply true. "Your surveyor took your money to file a false measurement. That makes the easement void. That makes the mining claim void. That makes everything you've spent 7 years building legally meaningless." She paused. "You can go to the hearing and fight it. Spend another year in courts. Spend money you don't have to lose. Or you can withdraw the claim today, walk away with no further legal exposure for the fraud your actions caused, and let this end." Voss looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. "Who are you?" he said, not rudely, genuinely. "I'm Clara Hayes," she said. "I grew up on a farm. My father taught me to read land filings because we couldn't afford a lawyer. I married a man everyone in town told me had nothing." She held his gaze. "I was right about him, and I'm right about this." Voss turned back to Caleb. Something was working in his face, the long, slow reckoning of a man whose story about himself is encountering a different story and having to decide which one to believe. "If I walk away," he said, "what happens to the mining claim? It's withdrawn. Any future claims on the watershed are subject to standard territorial process, which you can pursue through proper channels if you have legitimate basis. Caleb paused. But you'll do it without fraud, and without Aldrich. Voss's eyes sharpened. Aldrich. We know, Caleb said. We have documentation. We're not filing it today because we don't need to, we have Webb. But if this goes to hearing, everything goes to hearing. The four men outside were still. Henry in the hallway was still. The whole valley seemed for a moment to hold its breath. Voss stood. He looked at the room, the maps, the ledgers, the simple working interior of a house built for purpose rather than display. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. He said, "Your father would have settled." "I'm not my father," Caleb said. Voss nodded slowly. Something in his face settled, not peacefully, but finally. The way a long-running argument settles when the person who's been losing it stops fighting and accepts the loss. "I'll have my attorney contact Prescott," he said. He walked out. His four men followed. The sound of horses on the valley path faded. Caleb didn't move for a long moment after Voss left. Clara stayed in her chair and gave him the silence, because she'd learned in these days that he processed things inward, that his exterior went still when his interior was working, and pushing into that stillness didn't help. Finally he said, "He might not follow through." "He might not," she agreed. "But he will. He's a practical man and he just lost his leverage on every front simultaneously. Fighting forward costs him more than withdrawing." "You sounded very certain when you were talking to him." "I was certain," she said. 75% certain. He looked at her. That almost smile again, the quick one. "You said 70% about the survey stakes." "I'm learning as we go," she said. He sat back down across from her. He looked at the table, at the papers, the ledger, the account she'd been keeping of every piece of this. 7 days of work laid out in her handwriting across documents that had started as a stranger's filing room and had become, in some way, she was still working out hers. "Clara," he said. "Yes, I need to tell you something." He looked at her. "And I need to say it plainly without making it into a legal matter or a practical arrangement or anything other than what it is." She waited. "I was afraid," he said. "That's what this has been about from the beginning. Not afraid of Voss, not afraid of losing the valley, afraid of—" He stopped. Started again. "I built this place because I was afraid to exist in the world as someone who had things people wanted. I hid it because I was afraid of being wanted for the wrong reasons. I came to town and let people believe I was poor, because I was afraid that if I showed who I was, I'd see in people's eyes the same thing I'd seen in my whole life, the calculation. The interest. The moment when they stopped seeing me and started seeing what I owned." She said nothing. She let him finish. "And then you walked up to me in a general store," he said, "and told me you had nothing and needed someone, and would I please consider marrying you?" He paused. "And there was not one single calculation in your face. Not one. You were scared and tired, and you looked at me like I was a person and not an opportunity, and I—" He looked at his hands. "I chose you before you finished your sentence. I just needed one thing to be true first." She looked at him steadily. "Whether I'd say yes without the valley?" "Yes." "And I did." "You did." She thought about the woman she'd been 7 days ago, standing in Purdy's store with 36 sleepless hours behind her and $412 of debt and a brother who needed medicine. She thought about what it had felt like to speak her need out loud to a stranger and not die of the shame of it. She thought about what it felt like now. "Caleb," she said. "Yes, I need to tell you something plainly, too." She held his gaze. "I didn't come here with feelings. I came here with a problem that needed solving. I came here out of desperation and calculation and the complete absence of any other option." She paused. But somewhere between the filing room and the faked argument, and the 75% certainty, and the stakes in the dark, something changed. She let that settle. "I don't know exactly what to call it yet, but I want you to know it's there. and that it has nothing to do with the valley, or the money, or the silver under the mountain. He looked at her. His face did the thing she'd only seen twice before, that open, startled quality, the window unlatching. But this time, it stayed open longer. "Okay," he said, very quietly, as though the word were the most important one he'd said in years. "Okay," she said. They stayed that way for a moment, just the two of them in the room where they'd spent the last 7 days fighting a war. And the quiet was the best kind, not empty, not waiting. Just full. Then Thomas knocked on the door frame. "Is it over?" he said. They both looked at him. "The dangerous part," Clara said. "Yes." Thomas considered this. "Good," he said. "Because Elsa is making something for dinner that smells extraordinary, and I'd like to eat it without worrying about land fraud." Caleb stood up. He laughed, a real one, unguarded, the first she'd heard from him. It changed his face completely. Took years off it. Made him look for a moment like a man who had forgotten to be careful. She thought she could get used to that sound. That evening, Prescott sent word. Voss's attorney had contacted him. Withdrawal papers would be filed by the end of the week. The mining claim would be dropped. The easement challenge would be settled by formal acknowledgement of the recalibration with a corrected boundary filing replacing the 1869 document in the territorial record. Aldrich had resigned from his position in Denver that afternoon. No charges filed. Caleb had made that choice himself, not from mercy, but from his reading of Aldrich as a man who had made a bad choice 20 years ago and had been too cowardly to undo it, and had lived with that cowardice until it had made him someone he hadn't set out to be. Sometimes Caleb said the worst punishment is having to keep being yourself. Clara had not argued with that. She'd thought about it, though. The trust structure for the Whitmore property was filed the same day. Thomas's name was on the document as beneficial owner. The debt was settled. The farm was clean. Thomas came to find her that evening with the trust document in his hand and looked at it for a long time. "This is ours," he said. "It's yours," she said. "Clean and protected." He looked at her. "You did this." "Caleb paid for it," she said. "You built it," Thomas said. "Don't do that thing where you give the credit away." She looked at her brother, thin, still pale, but breathing well in the mountain air, already talking to Tate about the metalwork, already asking Henry questions about the valley's winter supply chain, with the curious, hungry mind of a young man who had been stuck in one place and had just discovered there was more world than he'd thought. "I'm going to be okay here, Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her carefully. "Are you going to be okay here?" She thought about that. She thought about it honestly. She thought about the filing room and the lamps that didn't smoke, and the man who brought food she didn't stop to eat and left it anyway. She thought about 43 people, and the children who had no parents, and the woman who came broken and stayed to bake bread. She thought about what it felt like to be taken seriously in the middle of a fight that mattered. "Yes," she said, "I am." Thomas nodded. He folded the trust document carefully and put it in his shirt pocket close to where he kept important things. "He's a good man," he said. "Strange, complicated, but good." "Yes," Clara said. "He looks at you," Thomas said, "like he's afraid you're not real." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. She turned back toward the main house where lamplight showed in the window, and Caleb's shape moved inside, doing some ordinary thing she couldn't tell what, just the silhouette of a man at home in his own life for the first time in years. She walked toward it. The withdrawal papers arrived on a Friday. Prescott sent them by Ryder, a thick envelope with the Territorial Land Office seal and Voss's attorney's signature on every page that mattered. Caleb read them at the table in the main house with Henry beside him and Clara across from him, and when he finished, he set them down and didn't say anything for a moment. Henry picked them up and read them himself. He read slowly, the way a man reads something he needs to be certain of before he allows himself to believe it. "It's done," Henry said. Caleb looked at the envelope. "It's done," he said. Clara watched them both. The two men who had been guarding this valley together for 7 years, sitting in the quiet of a thing finally finished. She didn't say anything. Some moments didn't need a woman who had been here 9 days weighing in on them. Some moments belonged to the people who had carried the weight the longest, and the right thing to do was witness them. Thomas, sitting near the window with his medicine and a book he'd borrowed from Caleb's shelf, looked up. "So we won." "We won," Caleb said. Thomas nodded once, the way young men nod when they're trying to look unsurprised by things that surprise them considerably. Then he looked back at his book. But Clara saw his shoulders drop, the specific release of someone who has been braced for impact for a very long time and has finally been told the thing isn't coming. She felt it too. The exhale. The sudden awareness of how long she'd been holding herself tight. Caleb looked at her across the table. She looked back at him. "Thank you," he said. "Don't," she said. "Clara." "This was mine too," she said. "My farm. My brother. My marriage." She held his gaze. "You don't thank someone for protecting what's theirs." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said very simply, "All right." But the valley didn't let them rest long. By afternoon, word had spread through the 51 people who now called the valley home. Thomas had brought the count to 44, and 6 more had arrived in the past week. 3 of them, a family from the eastern range that Caleb had quietly arranged shelter for before any of the Voss trouble started. 51 people who had spent 9 days watching the main house windows with the particular anxiety of people who have been displaced before and know how quickly security can reverse itself. When the word moved through that the withdrawal was filed and the claim was dead and the valley was clear, something happened that Clara hadn't expected. They came to the main house, not all at once, in ones and twos through the afternoon, knocking on the doorframe or simply appearing in the yard. Elsa came first, wiping flour from her hands on her apron, and said nothing at all. Just looked at Clara with those steady knowing eyes and nodded once. Tate came and shook Caleb's hand with his good arm for a long time, without speaking. The Henderson family came together. Husband, wife, 2 young children, who had never known any other home than this valley, and the wife cried quietly, looking at her hands. The 2 children who had no parents came last. A boy named Sam, maybe 9, and a girl named Ruth, who was 6, and had arrived at the valley holding Sam's hand, and had not, in Clara's observation, let go of it for any significant length of time since. They came to the door, and Sam said to Clara specifically, "Henry told us you fixed it." "Henry told you too much," Clara said. "He said you read a lot of papers and found the bad parts." Something like that. Ruth looked at her with the solemn attention of a 6-year-old who has learned to read rooms more carefully than most adults. "Are you staying?" she said. Clara looked at the girl. She looked at the valley behind her, at the people, the buildings, the mountain pressing in on all sides, the world that Caleb had built and hidden and protected, and that she had spent 9 days fighting to keep. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." Ruth seemed to consider whether this answer was satisfactory. Apparently, it was because she released Sam's hand, for the first time in Clara's memory, walked forward and put her arms around Clara's waist with the uncomplicated directness of a child who has decided to trust someone and sees no reason to be slow about it. Clara stood very still for a moment. Then she put her arms around the girl and held on. That night, after the house had quieted and Thomas was asleep, and Henry had finally gone to his own cabin, Caleb and Clara sat on the porch together for the first time. It was cold, mountain cold, the kind that gets into the seams of things, and she had a blanket around her shoulders, and he had a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and the stars above the valley were the kind of stars you only see at altitude, where the air is thin enough that light doesn't have to fight through much to reach you. They sat without talking for a while. It was the comfortable kind of not talking, not empty, not avoidant. Just 2 people being present in the same place at the same time without needing to fill it. Then Caleb said, "I owe you something." "You don't," she said. "Not a debt," he said. "A truth." He turned his cup in his hands. "Before you came to the valley, before I rode to town that morning, I had already spoken to Prescott. I'd asked him to look into the farms on the southern approach and tell me which families might be in financial trouble. He gave me 3 names. Your family was one of them. She'd known this, or she'd suspected it since the night he'd first told her about Voss's strategy. But hearing it said plainly was different. You chose me specifically, she said. No, he said. I came to town to look. I didn't know what I would do or who I would speak to. I told myself I was going to assess the situation and find a way to help the affected families that didn't require. He stopped. That didn't require me to be involved personally. But then, I walked up to you in the store, she said. You walked up to me in the store, he said. And I didn't assess anything. I just decided, before I thought about it clearly. He paused. I want you to know that. The decision wasn't strategic. It was completely irrational, and I knew it, and I made it anyway. She looked at the stars. Caleb, she said. Yes. I know. He glanced at her. I've known since the second day, she said. Maybe earlier. The way you spoke, the way you'd prepared things. A man who truly had nothing doesn't arrive at a woman's farm before dawn with a second horse already saddled. She paused. I knew something was deliberate. I didn't know the scale of it yet, but I knew it wasn't accidental. He was quiet. And you came anyway, he said. I came anyway, she said. Because even if every practical thing you did was planned, the look on your face in that store was not. She turned to look at him. You were holding your breath. Did you know that when I finished speaking, you were holding your breath like a man who was afraid of the answer? He didn't deny it. I was, he said. That, she said, was the part that was real. That's the part I chose. The mountain dark pressed in around them, enormous and permanent, and completely indifferent to the small warm fact of 2 people sitting on a porch deciding to trust each other. He reached out and took her hand. He did it simply without preamble, the way he did most things directly without excess ceremony. His hand was warm despite the cold, and she felt the calluses she'd noticed in the store, the hands of a man who built things. She let him hold it. I'm going to get it wrong sometimes, he said. I've spent a long time alone, and I have habits that don't account for other people. I know, she said. I'll be too careful when I should speak. I'll disappear into my own head when you need me present. Probably, she said. And Caleb, she said. Yes, I'll get it wrong too, she said. I'll push when I should wait. I'll manage things you wanted to handle yourself. I'll read your filing room at midnight and not tell you what I'm looking for until I'm sure. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you've already done that. Yes, she said. I have. So, we're already in it. She looked at him. That's how I know we can do it. He held her hand and looked at the stars. After a while he said, When I was a boy, my father used to say that a home is not the walls. It's not the land or the money or the name on the deed. He paused. He said a home is the thing that happens between the people inside it. The specific weight of their history together. The particular way 2 people learn to occupy the same world. He was quiet for a moment. I never understood what he meant. I thought I did, but I didn't. I built this valley, and I had the walls and the land and the deed, and I had 40-some-odd people and the work of 7 years, and I still didn't understand what he meant. She waited. I understand it now, he said. She held his hand in the mountain cold and didn't say anything because there was nothing to add to that. The weeks that followed were ordinary in the way that life after a crisis is always ordinary, almost aggressively, so as though the world were compensating for the intensity of what came before. Thomas got stronger. The mountain air did something for his lungs that the valley medicine had never quite managed, and within 3 weeks, he was working half days alongside Tate in the metal workshop, learning things that made his eyes light up in a way Clara hadn't seen since before their father died. He had her father's hands careful, precise, good with detail, and Tate, who was 30 years his senior and had no patience for incompetence, but infinite patience for genuine effort, took him seriously from the first day. The valley's population grew to 58 by December. Clara didn't engineer it. She didn't have to. Caleb had been quietly providing shelter for years. Word moved through certain networks the way word always moves when there is somewhere safe to go. What changed was that Clara organized the intake. She created a system, not a bureaucratic one, nothing that would make people feel processed rather than welcomed, but a practical one. A way of understanding what each person could contribute, what each person needed, how to make the fit work for everyone. She did it the way she did everything, by reading the room, by asking the right questions, by staying up late with a lamp that didn't smoke, and making sure the numbers added up. Caleb watched this happen with the expression she'd come to know as his version of happiness. Not loud, not effusive. Just the specific quality of stillness that settled over him when something was going right. Henry one evening said to her, "He was running this place alone for 7 years." "I know," she said. "He was good at it," Henry said, "but he was running it like a man who expects to be alone forever, like someone building something for other people because he didn't believe it would ever be for himself." She looked at Henry. "He believes it now," Henry said. She thought about that for a long time afterward. The first real fight happened in November. It was about money, not the lack of it, but the use of it. Caleb wanted to expand the eastern stable to accommodate more horses through the winter. Clara had looked at the supply projections and thought the feed costs through a hard winter were going to stretch further than he was accounting for. She said so. He disagreed. He said the horses were necessary for the valley's operations, and that he had managed the winter supply costs for 7 years without running short. She said that was before 58 people, and he should look at her numbers before dismissing them. He looked at her numbers. He sat with them for a long time and didn't say anything. And she understood that this was not stubbornness, but his process. He needed to work through it internally before he could speak about it externally. She gave him the time. Finally, he said, "You're right about the feed, but the stable is still necessary." "Then we source the feed differently," she said. "Not through Denver, through the Carroll operation they've been buying from the Western suppliers who come through in October. We can negotiate a bulk arrangement." He looked at her. "Did you already look into the Carroll pricing?" he said. "Yesterday," she said, "without telling me. I was going to tell you when I had something solid." She held his gaze. "I told you I'd manage things you wanted to handle yourself. I'm doing it right now. You can be annoyed about the process, or you can look at the pricing." He was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. "I'm going to do both." But he took the pricing sheet she offered and read it, and the Carroll arrangement was what they did, and the eastern stable got built before the first hard snow, and not once did he bring it up again. She filed that away too. The way he disagreed directly, without lingering, without nursing it. Like a man who had learned the difference between having a feeling and letting it run the room. She was still learning that difference herself, but she was learning it faster here with him. The letter from Morton Hale came in early December. It was not what she'd expected. It was not legal. It was not threatening. It was a single handwritten page, personal stationery, and it began, "I believe I owe you an explanation." She read it twice before she brought it to Caleb. Hale wrote that he had been approached 3 years ago by a Denver investment firm to handle certain debt instruments on their behalf. He had believed, or had wanted to believe, that the firm was a legitimate operation. He had not asked the questions he should have asked, because the arrangement was financially beneficial to the bank, and he had a family and a building loan, and the particular moral flexibility that financial pressure produces in otherwise decent men. He had not known, he wrote, that the firm was connected to Edmund Voss. He said this knowing, he wrote, that it was the kind of thing guilty men always say, and that Clara had no reason to believe him, and that he was saying it anyway because it was true, and because she deserved to know that her father had not been targeted by someone who knew him personally. He had been caught in a larger net. That didn't make it right. Nothing made it right. But he thought she should know. He closed by writing, "Your father was a good man who did not deserve what happened. You are, from everything I have observed, someone who does not need my good opinion, but you have it regardless." She sat with the letter for a long time. Caleb, reading it beside her, said nothing for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do with it?" She thought about her father's handwriting in the ledger. She thought about the debt notice under the door. She thought about 6 weeks of every door being closed, and then one door opening, and what had walked through it. "Nothing," she said. "He told the truth when he didn't have to. That's enough." Caleb looked at her. "You're more generous than I would be." "You're more patient than I would be," she said. "We balance out." He folded the letter and gave it back to her, and she put it in the filing room with the other documents of this particular season of her life, the legal papers, the survey recalibrations, the trust documents, the report she'd written in one night by a lamp that didn't smoke. She kept them not as trophies, but as record. Proof that it had happened. Proof that it had been real. The twist that changed everything came on a Tuesday in December, 3 days before the first hard snow. Prescott wrote in himself, not a message, not a writer. The attorney himself, which was the first signal that what he carried wasn't routine correspondence. He arrived in the late afternoon and asked to speak with both of them together, which was the second signal. Clara watched his face as he dismounted and shook Caleb's hand. Prescott was a careful man, professionally composed, but she had learned in her months of building cases that careful men showed things in their eyes before they showed them in their words. His eyes were serious and complicated. "Come inside," she said. Prescott sat at the table and opened his leather case and produced a document she didn't immediately recognize. He set it in front of Caleb. "This was filed by your father's estate attorney." Prescott said, 17 years ago. "I found it during the Voss title research, buried in a secondary filing that wasn't cross-referenced to the main Hayes property records." He paused. "I don't know why it wasn't surfaced earlier. I suspect Aldrich knew about it." Caleb was reading. Clara watched his face. She watched it change. "What is it?" she said. Caleb set the document down. He set it down carefully, the way you set down something fragile. And then he looked at Prescott with an expression Clara had never seen on him before. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying a belief for so long that discovering it was wrong doesn't feel like relief. It feels like losing a familiar weight, disorienting, enormous. "It's a letter of intent," Caleb said slowly. "From my father, written a year before he died." He paused. "He wrote a formal letter of intent to transfer 40% of the Valley property to the workers who were living here at the time of his death." He looked at Prescott. He intended to give it to them. Formally. Legally. "He signed the letter of intent," Prescott said. "But he died before the formal transfer documents were executed. Technically, the intent was never fulfilled." Caleb was quiet. "Technically," Clara said, looking at Prescott. "What does that mean in practice?" "It means the transfer didn't happen legally," Prescott said. "The property passed to Caleb as sole heir with full title. The letter of intent has no binding legal force." He paused. "But it does establish your father's clear wishes." Clara looked at Caleb. He was somewhere far inside himself, working through something that she could see from the outside but could not follow into. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "What do you want to do?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. In his eyes, she saw the thing she'd seen once before in the general store, when she'd asked if she could make her proposition, and he'd stood very still and decided to be brave. "What my father wanted," he said. "He wanted them to have a stake. He wanted the people who built this place to own a piece of it." He looked at Prescott. "Can we execute it now?" "The transfer he intended." Prescott nodded slowly. "It would require the identification of current qualifying residents. The document specifies workers present at the time of the transfer, which we'd have to interpret as current residents since the original beneficiaries have changed, and a formal title transfer process. It's not simple, but yes, it's possible." "Do it," Caleb said. "Caleb," Prescott said carefully, "you'd be giving away 40% of a property that includes a significant silver mineral right." "I know what it includes," Caleb said. "The silver alone." "I know what it's worth," Caleb said. "My father wanted this. He didn't get to do it. I'm going to do it for him." He looked at Prescott steadily. "Draw up the papers." Prescott looked at Clara, perhaps expecting hesitation or pushback from the direction of the wife who had spent 2 weeks protecting this property. She looked back at him and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. This was the man she'd married, not the man with the valley or the silver or the 7 years of carefully managed secrets. The man who would give away 40% of everything he owned because his father had wanted it and hadn't gotten to do it. She'd known this man was in there. She'd married him before she had proof. They told the valley that evening. All 58 people gathered in and around the main house in the cold, and Caleb stood on the porch and told them plainly the letter, the intent, the transfer, what it meant, what each of them would own. The silence that followed was the kind that only happens when people receive news they don't know how to hold. Tate, who spoke rarely, said, "Your father wanted this." "Yes," Caleb said. "And you're honoring it." "Yes." Tate looked at his hands for a moment. The ones that had been rebuilt by a mining accident, and rebuilt again by 7 years of metalwork in this valley. He said, "Your father never met most of us." "No," Caleb said. "He wanted to give something to people he'd never met." "He wanted to give something to people who built things," Caleb said. "He didn't have to know your name to understand your value." Tate nodded slowly. He looked at the ground, then he looked up and said to no one in particular, "This is a good place." Nobody argued with that. Chud. Ruth found Clara afterward in the way Ruth found her, appearing silently at her elbow, with the patient certainty of a child who has decided that this particular adult is reliable. "Mr. Hayes gave us part of the valley," Ruth said. "Part of it, yes," Clara said. "Why?" Clara looked at the girl. "Because his father wanted people who worked and built and stayed to have something that was really theirs, something nobody could take away." Ruth thought about this with the serious attention she gave everything. "Do Sam and I get a part?" Clara looked at her. This was a question she hadn't considered. The letter specified workers, residents, people who'd built the place. 2 children who'd arrived with nothing and no one were a different category technically. She thought about what Caleb had done with the letter of intent. She thought about what his father had meant underneath the language. "I'll talk to Mr. Hayes," she said. She found him 20 minutes later and told him what Ruth had asked. He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Of course." "The letter specifies workers," she said. "Ruth and Sam are not workers," he agreed. "They're something more important." He paused. "They're the reason this place exists. Not them specifically, but people like them, people who had nowhere." He looked at Clara. "You know what I mean." She did. "I'll tell her," she said. She went back to Ruth and crouched down to the girl's eye level. "Yes," she said. "You and Sam get apart." Ruth looked at her. "Because we live here." "Because you belong here," Clara said. "That's the same thing." Ruth considered this. Then she said with the absolute conviction of a 6-year-old who has found an answer she approves of, "Good." She went to find Sam. Clara straightened up and stood in the cold mountain evening with 58 people and a valley and a marriage that had started as a practical arrangement and had become the most real thing in her life, and she felt something she hadn't felt in so long, she almost didn't recognize it. Safe. She felt safe, not because the threat was gone. Threats came back. She knew that. Not because the money was settled or the papers were filed or the legal structure was clean, but because she had looked at who was standing beside her and behind her and around her, and she understood for the first time in a very long time that she was not alone. Years later, when people talked about Hayes Valley, and they did talk about it throughout the territory, and eventually beyond, they talked about it the way people talk about places that seem to belong to a different category than ordinary life. They talked about the families who had come here with nothing, the workers who had built it with their hands, the children who had grown up knowing they were wanted, They talked about Caleb Hayes, who people had once called the poorest man in the valley, and who had turned out to be the most generous man in the territory. They talked about how he'd never spent money on display. No grand house, no fine clothes, no gestures designed to be witnessed. He'd spent it on people, on infrastructure, on the kind of investment that doesn't show on the outside, but holds everything up from within. And they talked about Clara. They talked about her in the way people talk about people who change the shape of a place simply by understanding it differently than anyone else had. She had arrived as a practical woman solving a practical problem, and she had stayed as something the valley had needed without knowing. It needed someone who could see the whole of a thing and name it clearly and fight for it without flinching. Elsa, who stayed in the valley until she was very old, used to say that the day Clara came down that ridge on the roan horse was the day the valley became a home rather than a refuge. A refuge, she'd say, is where you go when you have nowhere else. A home is where you choose to stay. Clara was the first person who saw this place and chose it. Not because she had to, because she understood what it was. Thomas stayed too for a while, long enough for his lungs to heal completely, long enough for Tate to teach him everything he knew, long enough to realize that the world was larger than he'd thought, and he wanted to see more of it. He left at 20 with Caleb's blessing and a horse and more money than he'd ever held, and he came back every spring without fail, because some places you can leave and still belong to. Henry lived out the rest of his life in the valley. He never said much about it. He didn't need to. Ruth grew up and became, against all probability, the territory's first female land surveyor. She came back to the valley to survey the formal boundary documents when the 1876 recalibration was finally fully integrated into the territorial record, and when she drove the first stake into the corrected southern boundary, she did it with the same directness she'd had at 6 years old. No ceremony, no speech, just the work done right. She told Clara afterward, "I remembered what you said, that I belonged here because this was my home." "I remember saying it," Clara said. "I've said it to myself every time I wasn't sure I was in the right place." Ruth paused. "It turns out it works anywhere, not just here." Clara looked at the woman Ruth had become, capable, direct, sure of herself, in a way that still held the child's certainty underneath it, the certainty of someone who had been told clearly and early that they were wanted. "Good," Clara said, the same word Ruth had used at 6, the same absolute approval. It was Caleb who said the thing that Clara turned over in her mind for the rest of her life. He said it on an evening in winter, one of the winters a few years in, when the valley was full and the snow was deep, and the main house was warm with people and the particular richness of a life built on purpose. They were on the porch, cold, because they always sat on the porch when they needed to talk about the true things. The cold kept them honest, somehow kept them from softening edges they needed to see clearly. He said, "Do you ever think about that morning in the store?" "Sometimes," she said. "What do you think about?" She thought about it honestly. "I think about how close it was," she said. "If Gideon Purdy had lent me money. If Morton Hale had given me until spring. If any single door had opened before yours. You wouldn't have come to me," he said. "I wouldn't have come to you," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I think about that too," he said. "I think about what my life looks like if you don't walk up to me in that store. A valley with 58 people and no one managing the supply projections," she said. He almost smiled. "More than that." She looked at him. "I had a home," he said. "I had the valley and the people and 7 years of building something that mattered. But I was living in it like a caretaker, like someone responsible for a thing rather than someone who belonged to it." He paused. "You changed that. Not because you solved the legal problems or built the systems or found the fraud. Because you decided this was yours. You claimed it." He looked at her. "No one had ever claimed it before. Claimed me." She held his gaze. "You were worth claiming," she said. He reached for her hand, the same way he always did, directly, without ceremony. The calluses she'd noticed in the store, the hands of a man who built things. She held it. I told everyone I had nothing, he said. I didn't know how wrong I was. You had everything, she said. You just didn't have anyone to share it with. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the table in those first nights, that open, startled quality. But it wasn't startled anymore. It had settled into something permanent. The look of a man who has stopped waiting for the thing he loves to disappear. I had land, he said. Money. A house. But not a home, she said. Not until you came, he said. The mountain dark was around them, enormous and permanent, and the valley was breathing below all 58 people and their lives and their pieces of the thing they'd built together, and the stars above were the kind that only exist at altitude. Clara held her husband's hand and looked at what their life had become, this life that had started with a debt notice under a door and a stranger counting coins, and a woman who walked up to him because she had run out of every other option. She thought about what it meant that the best thing in her life had come from the worst moment. She thought about her father's voice numbers are never the problem. The problem is always the line that someone else drew. She had redrawn the line. They both had. A person's greatest treasure is not what they own, and not even who chooses to stay. It is the knowledge earned through fire and stubbornness, and the willingness to be seen clearly, that the home you built was real, and the love inside it was chosen freely, and neither one will ever be taken from you again.